I was sitting at a local park recently, watching two groups of people who clearly didn't belong in the same zip code, let alone the same conversation. On one side of the fountain, a group was decked out in tactical-style protest gear, shouting slogans about preserving our rights. On the other, a crowd was just as loud, screaming about protecting our future. The air was thick with that specific kind of modern electricity, the kind where you're just waiting for someone to throw the first punch. There was one woman in the middle of it all, her face flushed a deep crimson, veins popping in her neck as she hurled insults at a man across the invisible line. She wasn't just disagreeing, she looked like she was trying to delete him from existence with her eyes. To her, in that moment, he wasn't a person with a life or a family. He was a manifestation of a threat, a biological error that needed to be corrected. Then something small happened. A toddler, belonging to a family in the opposing group, tripped on the jagged pavement and let out a sharp, panicked cry. For a split second, the yelling stopped. That same woman, the one who had just been calling for blood, flinched. Her hand reflexively moved toward her heart. She looked at the child, then at the father, who was rushing to pick him up, and for a single heartbeat, the enemy vanished. In its place was just a worried parent and a hurt kid. But as soon as the child was comforted, the wall slammed back down. She caught herself, looked momentarily embarrassed by her own instinct, and went right back to shouting. It was a jarring, almost clinical display of how our brains are currently wired. We have become experts at dehumanizing the others until a sudden flash of shared human suffering forces the machinery to glitch. It made me wonder, if we can be so easily triggered into hatred by a slogan, but so instinctively moved by a stranger's pain, which version of us is the real one? We are living in an era where we are more connected than ever, yet we are paradoxically growing more hostile, treating polarization not just as a difference of opinion, but as a survival mechanism. It turns out that the most effective way to dismantle this hostility isn't through a better argument or more data, but through a response so simple it feels almost radical.
That scenario in the park is, it's essentially a perfect microscopic view of the exact mechanism playing out across every facet of modern society right now. We're watching a fundamental biological response to perceived threats. And to really understand the anatomy of that response and how to dismantle it, we have to look at environments where the stakes are incredibly high and where interventions are actually being rigorously tracked.
Right, because we need to see what works when the pressure is on.
Exactly. And one of the most compelling foundational examples of this actually takes place in an educational system. Specifically, it's a secondary school in a really densely packed multicultural borough of East London.
Yeah, that East London environment is fascinating because when you look closely at it, you're looking at a microcosm of global tension. You've got a classroom where the air is just thick with the unspoken friction of the streets outside. The students are bringing all the complexities, all the animosities of their neighborhoods directly to their desks.
They don't just leave it at the door.
No, they carry it with them. And there were these two boys in this particular classroom, Amir and Callum. Their families lived maybe, 3 blocks apart. But they were basically in entirely different universes.
Like completely different realities.
Callum's family was defined by this fading sense of local heritage. They represented a legacy in a neighborhood that was rapidly changing around them, both demographically and politically.
And then Amir's situation was entirely different.
Exactly. Amir's family was defined by the immigrant struggle. They had just recently relocated to the area to escape instability back home. So for months, these two boys gave each other nothing but glares.
Just absolute silence.
Just palpable hostility. It was that specific kind of quiet, simmering aggression that you just know is going to eventually turn into a physical altercation.
And in a traditional disciplinary framework, the administration would just, they'd watch that tension, wait for the inevitable physical fight to happen in the hallway, and then hand out suspensions.
Right, the classic reactionary model.
But this school did something else. They piloted a program called a compassion circle as part of their standard curriculum. And the mechanics of this are highly specific. It is not, and this is crucial, it's not an unstructured conversation where kids just debate their political differences.
Because that would probably just make it worse.
Oh, it almost always makes it worse. This is a meticulously facilitated exercise meant to bypass those defensive layers of identity. So during one session, the facilitator asked the students a very specific prompt. They asked them to share a visceral moment of fear they had experienced in their lives.
And the vulnerability required to actually answer that in a hostile room is huge. When it got to Amir, he talked about the night his family fled their home. He detailed the actual physical sensation of running in the dark, the profound uncertainty of whether they were going to survive.
And the immediate expectation in a room that polarized is that the other side is going to roll their eyes or dismiss it.
Right. They're going to minimize the vulnerability. But then Callum spoke. And he didn't give a defensive counter-narrative. He didn't offer a political talking point. He talked about the night his dad lost his job. Yeah. He described a heavy silence in his house afterward and this persistent, gnawing fear of how his family was going to survive. And when you look at what happened in that room at that exact moment, those rigid labels of outsider and local, they just vanished.
They evaporated.
Now, they didn't become best friends overnight. That's a movie script, not psychological reality. But the physical aggression completely stopped. When you strip away the tribal banners, you often just find young people looking for a reason not to be afraid of each other.
And implementing something like compassion training in schools sounds to a lot of people like a really soft response to a hard social problem.
It sounds like soft idealism.
But seeing that bridge built between Amir and Callum proves it's actually a highly practical survival skill for society. And to grasp why it works, we have to look at the neuroscience. We have to strictly differentiate compassion from empathy.
Because people use those words interchangeably all the time, but they function entirely differently in the human brain.
Empathy is the capacity to share and understand the emotions of another person. You literally feel what they are feeling. And while that's a vital trait, it has a really dangerous limitation in intense intergroup conflicts.
Because it can just overwhelm you.
Exactly. Empathy leads to emotional overwhelm.
That's a crucial thing for you to consider as you listen to this deep dive. If you are just absorbing the pain or the fear or the intense anger of someone from an opposing group, your own central nervous system just gets flooded.
And when you're flooded with negative affect, you paralyze, you withdraw, or you lash out defensively.
You can't build a cohesive society if the primary tool for connection just causes everyone to shut down from emotional exhaustion. Empathy in a high conflict zone is basically a fast track to burnout.
Which is why compassion is so different. Compassion operates on a fundamentally different neurological pathway. It's strictly other-focused. It's not just witnessing suffering. It's experiencing a motivated active desire to alleviate that suffering.
And you can actually see this on brain scans, right?
Neuroimaging shows that when someone experiences raw empathy, the pain centers of the brain, like the anterior insula, light up. The brain literally mirrors the distress. But when someone engages in compassion, the brain regions associated with positive emotions, reward, and affiliation activate.
The dopaminergic pathways.
Yes, the dopamine hits. And that biological shift is what allows a person to engage in pro-social behavior without being paralyzed by the negativity of the situation. You stay emotionally regulated, which lets you engage constructively, even with someone who holds deeply opposing views.
And this ties directly into the evolutionary idea of common humanity. The biological imperative here is all about protecting the vulnerable to ensure the group survives. Cultivating this sense of shared suffering actively reduces extreme cognitive biases.
It frames the outgroup's fear as part of a shared human architecture.
Exactly. Once you internalize that suffering is a universal condition, whether it's Amir fleeing his home or Callum watching his dad lose his livelihood, it becomes so much easier to view outgroup members favorably. It counteracts the biases that fuel polarization.
It's been rigorously tested in places where polarization is a matter of violent ethnic conflict. Look at the 2018 Call to Care Israel study, the C2CI study by Berger, Brennick, and Tarash.
This one is incredible.
It involved 324 Israeli Jewish students, 3rd to 5th grade in central Israel. And the context is vital here. It's an area with ongoing ethnic conflict where Israeli Jewish and Israeli Palestinian populations live highly segregated lives.
And in those hyper-segregated environments, traditional prejudice reduction usually fails. The standard idea has always been contact theory. Just put opposing groups in a room and they'll realize their shared humanity.
Right, which sounds great on paper.
But in a conflict zone, the opportunity for contact doesn't even exist. And if you artificially create it, putting traumatized, hostile groups in a room without cooperation backfires. It reinforces stereotypes and causes immediate psychological entrenchment.
You have to operate on the individual's internal state first, and that's what the CTI intervention did. They used a 24-week program based on the Sustainable Compassion Training Model, the SCT.
So they didn't even bring the outgroup into the room.
It's an indirect approach. It builds a psychological foundation first. The 24 weeks were divided into 3 phases. Phase 1 was just receiving care. The goal was to help these kids recognize the universal need for care and dismantle beliefs like, I don't need anyone's help.
So they spent weeks just visualizing moments of care from parents or teachers, building a mental representation of safety.
Exactly, building that baseline. Then phase 2 shifted to developing self-care. This is where the physiology comes in. They taught mindfulness techniques, body scans, mindful breathing.
To regulate the autonomic nervous system.
Right. The kids learned to recognize the physical signs of escalating into a hyper-aroused high zone of stress or anger. And then they use contemplative practices to bring their nervous system back to a regulated baseline, which the program called the resilient zone.
Which is brilliant, because you cannot ask a child to extend compassion to a perceived enemy if their body is locked in fight or flight.
It's biologically impossible. So only after establishing that foundation did they move to phase 3, extending care. They directed the compassion outward, starting safely with loved ones, then strangers, and eventually people they inherently disliked.
And then ultimately, Israeli-Palestinian youth.
Yes. By the time they were asked to consider the ultimate outgroup, they had a regulated nervous system. They weren't reacting from a place of raw threat.
The theory behind this is so solid. You've got the social cognitive developmental theory, which says that perspective taking is key to reducing prejudice. The mindfulness allowed the students to step outside their rigid experiences and observe their bodily sensations without judgment.
It frees the mind from automatic stereotyping.
Right. If you observe your anger just as a physical sensation instead of an absolute truth about the world, it loses its authority over your behavior.
And then there's Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory. Positive emotions, like the warmth cultivated in the program, literally broaden cognitive flexibility. Negative emotions narrow our focus to survival.
They cause tunnel vision.
Exactly. But positive emotions broaden the visual and cognitive fields. It gives the child the bandwidth to reevaluate societal norms.
And the data from the study back this up massively. Compared to the weightless control group, the intervention group showed substantial reductions in affective prejudice, that negative emotional response to the outgroup. Negative stereotyping decreased, and their readiness for actual social contact increased.
But the most critical data point came 6 months later.
Oh, the follow-up. This is the craziest part of the study.
Right, because usually intervention effects fade. But during that 6-month gap, there was a severe, violent escalation in the conflict. Normally, that drives populations straight back into their defensive postures.
But the intervention group maintained their positive effects despite the surrounding violence.
They did. While the control group's attitudes deteriorated further, the kids with the intrapersonal training held steady. It proves that altering the internal environment creates durable resilience against intense external pressures.
And taking that concept to a larger scale, you see programs like C-Learning Social, Emotional, and Ethical Learning. It was developed by Emory University with Dalai Lama, and it treats these values as empirical, teachable skills.
It's a highly organized matrix.
3 domains: personal, social, systemic, intersecting with 3 dimensions: awareness, compassion, engagement.
So in the personal domain, awareness is attending to your physical sensations. Compassion is self-kindness. Engagement is active self-regulation.
And as they master that, it expands to interpersonal relationships and then to the systemic domain, where awareness means appreciating global interdependence and compassion is recognizing common humanity on a societal scale.
And they don't expect kids to just instantly get it. It moves from received knowledge, just listening to the teacher, to critical insight, where the student analyzes it, to embodied understanding, where it becomes spontaneous behavior.
It addresses the root cause of societal issues, human decision-making and ethical discernment. But, and this is a big transition, people assume these tools are only for kids with developing brains.
Which is a huge misconception.
When you move into the corporate environment, you see the exact same mechanisms of polarization applying to adult professionals, sometimes even more acutely.
Absolutely. The modern workplace is totally susceptible to tribalism. Corporate filter bubbles degrade productivity massively. The biological response to a perceived outgroup threat, the amygdala hijack, it doesn't just turn off because you log into Slack or walk into a boardroom.
If political affiliations become salient at work, the nervous system responds to those differences with the same hyperarousal as a physical threat in the wild.
And you get organizational paralysis.
We saw a clear empirical illustration of this recently with a high-growth tech firm in Austin, Texas. You think of tech spaces as hyper-rational, but after a divisive election cycle, this company was basically paralyzed.
The Slack wars.
The Slack wars. The engineering and marketing teams siloed themselves based entirely on political affiliations. Communication broke down into passive-aggressive emojis and delayed handoffs. Productivity plummeted.
And the HR department realized standard conflict resolution wasn't working, so they brought in a structured mindfulness intervention.
Because the conflict was perfectly exemplified by two employees, Elena, a project lead, and Marcus, a senior dev. They could barely be on the same video call without making hostile, veiled remarks about each other's politics.
So the mindfulness program didn't ask them to debate their political stances. It required them to engage in strict, non-judgmental awareness exercises before and during their interactions.
It forced them to stop reacting to the political avatar they had built in their heads and start observing the actual human being in front of them. And Elena had this moment of critical insight.
Right, because by observing Marcus without that political filter, she realized his aggression wasn't about her politics at all.
It was severe professional burnout and a paralyzing fear of being replaced by AI. The corporate filter bubble was just masking his deep vulnerability with a loud, ideological threat display.
It proves non-judgmental awareness is essential. You have to shift the interaction away from identity defense. And clinically, mindfulness is exactly that. Sustained attention to present moment emotions and physical sensations with a strict attitude of non-judgmental awareness.
It's not just a relaxation technique.
No, it is a cognitive interrupt mechanism. Biologically, when you encounter an outgroup stimulus, the amygdala registers a threat and triggers hyperarousal. Mindfulness biologically interrupts that automatic sequence. It inserts a pause so your prefrontal cortex can override the primitive threat response.
And they track this physiologically in corporate settings. Employees learn to note when an email makes their chest tight or their skin flush. They map it on a spectrum.
Trying to catch when they get pushed into the hyper-aroused high zone or the hypo-aroused low zone of numbness.
By noting the sensations without judging them, they build a resilient baseline. They expand the resilient zone, so a routine disagreement over a deadline doesn't rapidly escalate into an identity-based threat.
Which brings us directly to how this applies to broader democratic polarization. When effective polarization, that intense emotional animosity toward political opponents, gets this high, it threatens the functionality of democracy itself.
And traditional political science assumes humans are rational actors. They think better information or logical debates will fix it.
But empirical research overwhelmingly shows information cannot counteract effective polarization. The hostility is rooted in the emotional threat detection systems, not the rational centers.
You cannot logic someone out of a biological survival response.
And there's a fascinating study out of a community center in Ohio that illustrates this. They gathered high partisanship individuals who viewed the other side as an existential threat.
And we have to look at one participant, Jem, a retiree who lived in a digital echo chamber. Algorithms just fed him anger all day. The researchers put Jim through a multi-week meditation course.
But they never asked him to change his vote. They bypassed the intellect. They just told him to observe the physical sensation of anger in his body when he thought about his political opponents.
Notice the jaw tension, the shallow breathing, and just sit with it non-judgmentally. And the climax of this happened at a highly charged town hall meeting about municipal zoning.
Jim sat next to a woman whose opposing yard signs he despised.
Normally, his amygdala would trigger heart-pounding vitriol. He'd be ready for a fight. But using the tools, he experienced this objective recognition of her physical exhaustion instead. He noticed her posture. He literally described it as a cooling of the blood.
That is the precise neurological moment the amygdala steps down from high alert.
By widening his resilient zone, the external partisan hostility was neutralized. He still disagreed with her zoning policies, but the biological threat was gone, allowing for civil democratic participation.
And this individual mechanism is backed up by massive quantitative data. The 2025 survey experiment by Ramstetter and colleagues is critical here. It was a 500-person U.S. study probing different meditations on effective polarization and climate change attitudes.
They contrasted mindfulness meditation, MM, which is just present moment awareness, with loving kindness meditation, LKM, which intentionally projects unconditional love and compassion.
And the results were highly complex. LKM successfully reduced effective polarization, but exclusively among self-identified Republicans.
Right, they saw a statistically significant effect, a beta of negative 0.13 on the feeling thermometer.
Which means if the scale is 0 to 100, where 0 is freezing hostility, LKM nudged the temperature up just enough to stop the ice from freezing over. It's the difference between screaming at a neighbor and maintaining civil coexistence.
But the treatment had a totally unintended side effect for self-identified Democrats. Instead of increasing pro-environmental attitudes like researchers hypothesized, it increased anthropocentrism.
A strictly human-centered worldview prioritizing human supremacy over environmental concerns.
Which strongly suggests that pure awareness, without cultivating interpersonal connectedness, can backfire depending on your ideological starting point. Training a polarized mind to focus inward without directing compassion outward can solidify a closed loop.
You have to match the tool to the demographic. The baseline data showed Democrats started with significantly higher effective polarization, a beta of 0.45 higher than Republicans. Democratic women were the most polarized, Republican women the least.
So the theory is because Republicans had lower baseline animosity, the LKM had a wider aperture to work with.
That's one explanation. The other is that conservative ideology and higher levels of religiosity might prime individuals to be more receptive to LKM's concepts of unconditional universal love.
While the pure mechanics of lack that relational bridge, causing the isolated effect in Democrats.
Exactly. And this isn't just a U.S. phenomenon. Simonson's 2022 research looked at the Brexit debate in the UK, Remain versus Leave. They used a brief befriending meditation, similar to LKM.
And even a short audio intervention lowered polarization by 4.17 degrees on the feeling thermometer. It increased perceived commonality, letting them see shared human traits across the Brexit divide.
Which is why there's a movement to institutionalize this at the highest levels. Since 2013, the UK Parliament has offered evidence-based mindfulness courses to politicians to help them process debate without triggering defensive threat responses.
And Uppsala University's Karen Bruneas is doing the same with Swedish politicians right now, framing polarization not just as bad manners, but as an existential threat to democracy itself.
Utilizing mindfulness as a strategic tool to rebuild cross-party bridges.
So when you synthesize all this, from East London classrooms to Austin tech firms to European parliaments, the pattern is undeniable. Traditional methods like facts and logical debate fail because they assume polarization is a cognitive error.
But extreme effective polarization is anchored in the autonomic nervous system.
Fact checks cannot penetrate a nervous system chemically locked in a survival response. The emerging empirical consensus indicates that the architecture of human hostility cannot be dismantled by proving the other side wrong. It's about altering the neurological environment where the disagreement takes place. When the biological imperative to defend against an enemy is quieted through deliberate interpersonal training, the ideological dividing lines do not necessarily disappear. The differences in opinion remain, but the necessity for mutually assured social destruction is rendered entirely obsolete.